And so Harvard, Princeton, Yale, I'm very happy to say that the leaders of these great institutions have come to realize their past mistakes, misdeeds of their predecessors, and now are trying to do their best to open admission to all qualified people, regardless of whether they're Africans, Asians, Japanese, Americans, whites, and so on, and also hire professors who are truly qualified.
Join Lewis and I today as we speak with Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who is the director of the Institute of Semitic Studies at Princeton University and the chair of the board of the Ethiopian Peace and Development Center. Dr. Isaac has led an amazing life, starting out in Ethiopia before coming to America, where he rose to be the individual who started the African American Studies Department at Harvard University in the 1970s. He's had some of the most important figures in the civil rights movement pass through his classes. His work as an active peacemaker accelerated in the 1980s when he was chosen to help resolve a standoff between the Ethiopian government and rebel factions. He was inspired by his father's strong emphasis on Judaism as a religion of love, peace, and responsibility for others. But as a Jew in a majority Christian country, he appreciated that people respond best when they hear a call to peace from their own traditions. It was this insight that led him to utilize Ethiopia's traditional reconcilers and peacemakers to solve conflict. Dr. Isaac will be speaking with us today regarding the Supreme Court's recent decision on affirmative action and its effects on education and employment. You're in for a real treat from a person who was at Harvard at the beginning of affirmative action and has seen it through all these years.
Welcome to What I See, the podcast where we uncover the stories of visionaries, innovators, and entrepreneurs. Join us as we explore the big ideas and challenges shaping our future. And now our hosts, Mark O'Donnell and Lewis Schiff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to What I See. We find ourselves once again together, Mark, at the brink of probably one of the bigger topics you and I have taken on so far in the history of our podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So are you afraid? Are you nervous? Are you scared? Are you ready?
I'm not. I'm just totally curious. Obviously, we take things out of the news and think about how it pertains to entrepreneurship and running businesses. And the topic today is affirmative action and the big decision the Supreme Court made just a few weeks ago.
Yes, and that clearly makes us topical. Mark, you had suggested this as a topic a week or so ago, which I thought was a great one. You know, it's just at the outer edge kind of our innovators, visionaries, and entrepreneurs category, right? It's just at the really like the outer edge because it's not business, although it has huge implications for business. And it's, of course, about the business of educating as well. I'm going to introduce us in a moment to our special guest, but I want to tell a quick story about how I met him. Because for those of you who remember Tony Hsieh, the founder of Zappos, who's passed away since this happened, but he had this idea which he called collisions. And the idea was that in the journey of our lives, we had to maximize the collisions between people, because when two people or more collide, anything's possible. And my story of meeting our guest is exactly that. So, as Mark mentioned, the topic is affirmative action. The reason why we're talking about it now is that the Supreme Court of the United States recently essentially agreed to sunset affirmative action as it pertains to the U.S. college and university application process, making it essentially illegal to factor in race or other categories when considering whether or not somebody should be accepted into a college. And it has generated a ton of conversation. And our special guest today is Dr. Ephraim Isaac. Dr. Isaac, come on and join us when you're ready. Dr. Isaac has an illustrious career, primarily in academics. Hi, Dr. Isaac. We see you now.
Hello. Peace. Shalom.
Thank you. Thank you. Peace to you. I'm so excited because we met in what Tony Shea would call a collision. It's not the most glamorous story. We met at a bar, but it's
Education.
an educational bar. It's an educational institution that happens to have a bar. And I sat next to him, and we got into talking, and he was telling me about his background, and I sort of caught it, but I didn't quite understand who I was talking to. But one of the things is he mentioned his name to me, and I went back to my hotel room later, and I Googled him, and I could not believe who I had been talking to. So, so when we thought about this topic of affirmative action, we thought, who better than a lifelong teacher to help us understand the implications, ramifications of this Supreme Court decision. But he's not just a lifelong teacher. Dr. Isaac, who comes from Ethiopia, when he comes to America, one of the places he ends up is Harvard, where he ends up being an instructor, professor there. And he starts in the 1970s the African American Department of Study, which is clearly connected to the topic of affirmative action. He then remarkably, after finishing his career at Harvard, ends up at Princeton, where he works on the Department of Semitic Studies. That's the religion of Judaism and all the languages that surround that. He is an Ethiopian Jew. That's how he introduced himself to me. And I happen to be Jewish, but he's much more knowledgeable about the Jewish religion than I am. And today he is the director for the Institute for Semitic Studies in Princeton, continues to gather people from around the world to talk about the Semitic language and all the languages that fall under that category and their role in history. He is also, the last point I want to make before we start talking to him, he is a renowned deconflictor, conflict negotiator. When countries and groups cannot figure out how to get along, they bring in deconflictors. And he has an incredible global background in helping to deconflict some of the most conflicted areas of the world. So, wow, when Mark suggested affirmative action, and then I thought, well, what about this person I just met at a bar? But it's no joke. So welcome, Dr. Isaac. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Louis. It's a great pleasure to see you again, not at a bar, but on a podcast.
Well, I think it was more real at a bar. Now it's just a two-dimensional version of us.
Well, I thank you very much for inviting me to discuss with you or talk with you about this very important subject of affirmative action.
Now, Mark, I know I want to give it over to you to get us talking, but I also have a thing I just want to bring up in the beginning, which is, Dr. Isaac, as we start to get into this topic of affirmative action, which is about race primarily, I wonder if you conform your answers partly because you're talking to two white men. Is that part of your thought process, or is your way of looking at this and your way of thinking this the same for everyone, no matter who you're talking to?
I don't see people as white or black, but as human beings. So I'm talking to human beings. But let me say the following. The question of affirmative action is of great importance to me because it's of great importance to a large number of the people of African origin. I came to Harvard University in 1960. At that time, there were like 3 African American or African graduate students and about a dozen African American students. Now, for me, affirmative action did not mean admitting unqualified students into a great university like Harvard University. It meant reversing the historical rejection of highly qualified students of African origin simply because they were black, or also, by the way, women. Less qualified white students were being admitted. Indeed, when we speak about affirmative action today, we must recognize that big universities like Harvard, Yale, Princeton have a history, an open history of, unfortunately, racism. Let's start, for instance, with Yale University. Yale had a very distinguished professor called Calhoun, who said, "Find me a black man who can read Greek and Latin, and then I'll consider black people human." This is the kind of attitude. Now, Princeton University, of course, is very well known to have been a university that worked very closely with the slave South. The first 9 professors, presidents of Princeton University had slaves. Indeed, at one stage, 60% of the graduating class came from slave-holding families in the South. At Harvard, in the early 20s, Lowell, the president of Harvard, did not want to admit more black or Jewish students. So he made a rule that to be admitted to Harvard University, you have to qualify morally, not only academically. And why morally? Because he expected Jews and African Americans not to be of Christian moral standard. I am very happy to say that today, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, these great universities have come to the recognition of the fact that they have a discriminatory slave background. Not only that, I personally can tell you more about what happened at Harvard University. When I came to Harvard, I went into the library and I started finding books that describe Africans as subhuman. My late good friend Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book called The Mismeasure of Man. You can read in that book that, for instance, they said African Americans or black people have a smaller brain. Their face actually like have an angle that is between the wide angle of a white man and the narrow angle of a crocodile. A lot of work were written in the 19th century denigrating African people. Some German scholars, French scholars, and others have written that people of the world can be classified into 4 categories: the rational whites, the commonsensical Asians, the phlegmatic American Indians, and the emotional Africans. As I said, the famous Yale University Calhoun said, "If you find me a black man who would read Greek and Latin, I'll consider them human." The irony is, even before affirmative action, Harvard and also Yale had admitted a few minority African Americans. The first black person Harvard admitted was a man called Richard Greener, who studied history and in fact ended up teaching Greek and Latin at the University of South Carolina. It is said that even before Greener, there was an African American brilliant fellow who served one of the Harvard presidents, and he knew Greek so well that he may have actually been admitted, but maybe not graduated, and he ended up being a tutor of Greek and Latin for the president of Harvard. The bottom line is that African Americans and African people also loved learning. I think it is Booker T. Washington who said the Negro worshiped the books. I come from a country, Ethiopia, one of the countries into which one of the 7 languages that the Bible was first translated is the African language of Ethiopia called Ge'ez. The only ones that compare with that are Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and the first 7 languages into which the Bible was translated. So African people, especially in Ethiopia and even in ancient Egypt, also believed in knowledge. So affirmative action, to me, I repeat, does not mean admitting unqualified people, but it means opening the doors that have been totally closed. Because originally in the universities, they did not admit many African Americans, although they were qualified. Less qualified white students were admitted. And therefore, in 1965, when the affirmative action was declared, it opened the door that universities can no longer deny admission to highly qualified African Americans and African people of African origin. In short, for me then, there is a misunderstanding of what affirmative action means by people. They think it's just like as one, in fact, ironically, a black professor at Harvard who was against affirmative action in 1972 wrote in the New York Times, said Harvard was admitting too many ghetto blacks who are not qualified. I don't want to mention the name of this black professor, but the dean or provost of Princeton University wrote back a letter to the New York Times saying, no, we are not admitting unqualified people, and showed how the kind of education most of the black students at Princeton were admitting, the kind of education they have received, how they are very capable. So essentially then, I am very saddened when I hear this great institution we all respect and bow before, the Supreme Court, reverses the idea of affirmative action. I have great respect for those judges, but even judges can be short-sighted. We are all human, no matter who we are. I know for a fact that when I was teaching at Harvard University, there were highly qualified black students, I can mention a whole list of them, who have risen to be very important in American business world, academic world, educational world, medical world. Some of them my own students. So the misunderstanding of the concept of affirmative action then boils down to the following: that before the affirmative action and in the early days of the history of the United States, there was an assumption that black people of African origin, are intellectually inferior, cannot compete in universities. This is what you call discriminatory intellectual ideas. And let me give you a suggestion to my readers. Please read the late friend of mine, Stephen Jay Gould's book, Mismeasure of Man. Why Mismeasure of Man? Some of the early scholars, even the first 9 presidents of Princeton had slaves. So look at Africans are slaves. And those who believed that African Americans are inferior had some kind of low-level anthropological analysis. They were measuring the people's heads, comparing them to animals and so on and so forth. And therefore, this the idea of affirmative action for me, I repeat, does not mean that bringing a horde of unqualified people to universities, but rather rejecting the earlier philosophy of the denial of equal opportunity to people of African origin.
So, Dr. Isaac, thank you for that. That's impassioned, and that's a great education right there. A wonderful citing of references, plenty for us to go back and look into as well. The premise of that is that there was a period of time when there was a foundation of wrong-headed beliefs, false, wrong-headed beliefs that were shared by a lot of people in power. Now, almost every company or university that brings groups of people together acknowledges and realizes that diverse groups are better than non-diverse groups. That seems to be so well understood by the academic world and I think significantly by the business world. Do you think that the wrong-headed beliefs of the past have been replaced with a genuine appreciation for how diversity makes outcomes better in whatever endeavor someone's involved in?
Yes, thank you very much, Louis. Yes. As a matter of fact, in the last decade, the three universities, again, I mentioned, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, have come to the realization that they have a history of racism and that they must be corrected. Harvard University now, of course, enrolls since affirmative action. Even while I was there, well, let me add here, before I came, there was not a single course on African language, African religion, African history. After I finished my doctorate in 1969, I gave the first courses in African language, African history, African religions. This is amazing, 1971. And today, Harvard University has in fact set up a committee like Brown too has done so, and Princeton and Yale, to correct past misdeeds of the history of slavery. The Yale University has changed the name of Calhoun College now to another name. Princeton has changed the name of Woodrow Wilson, who had slaves also and believed in slavery, to another name. And so Harvard, Princeton, Yale, I'm very happy to say that the leaders of these great institutions have come to realize their past mistakes, the misdeeds of their predecessors, and now are trying to do their best to open admission to all qualified people, regardless of whether they're Africans, Asians, Japanese, Americans, whites, and so on, and also hire professors who are truly qualified. Let me add a footnote here. See, some people believe Africans were admitted to Harvard, Yale because of affirmative action. There were actually some African Americans who were admitted, like for instance, to Harvard, my university. I mentioned Richard Greener, who graduated in 1865, I think. Du Bois, who received his PhD around 1890. And Carter G. Woodson. In other words, there was no affirmative action. They were not admitted to Harvard because of affirmative action. They were black. But there were many like them who were not admitted because of, unfortunately, the quota of not admitting more African Americans. And I can mention a large number of Africans and African Americans who graduated from Harvard Divinity School, Harvard Medical School, Harvard Law School, which I know, who were admitted at a time when there was no affirmative action. In other words, they have always been capable, intellectually capable, qualified African and African Americans. But there was a quota in admitting just one or two. Like, it's interesting that until 1969, the number of African American students on Harvard when in the mid 60s were around less than 20. Mm-hmm. Then in 1971, when, of course, affirmative action was established and the university admitted its past mistakes of being discriminatory and rejecting peoples of African people as students and faculty, 100 people, 100 students were admitted in 1970, class of 1970. And I'm very happy I was there.
Mhm.
I witnessed that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Let me interrupt, Mark.
Yeah. I guess my question is, what role do you think affirmative action has played? And so prior, people had these ideas that were obviously misplaced and quite frankly sound kind of ridiculous to me, that people would actually measure people's heads and have all these types of ways of thinking. When did that pendulum shift where those thoughts started to dissipate, or are they still around today? I'm just wondering, did affirmative action do its job and it's time to move on because no one thinks that way anymore? Or there's still, certainly not in my world that I know of, that people think that way, but from a time perspective, did it run its course, do its job? Did it have an impact on the way people were thinking at that time? I quite frankly wasn't born yet, so none of that type of thinking existed in any of my worlds, and that might be just where and when I grew up. I don't know. Any thoughts about that?
well, unfortunately, the philosophy of intellectual discrimination has its roots in slavery. At a time
As
when
a justification for
the inferiority of
Mhm.
people, and inferiority, even intellectual inferiority. For instance, I have read articles. Well, I'll give you one very interesting example. I understand a Harvard professor in the late 20s objected not only to the admission of African Americans, but even women. And he wrote his book in which he claimed he has done a research that Harvard should not admit white women to the university. Why? Because he said, the more you study, the more you become intellectually strong, the bigger your brain becomes. And the smaller your womb becomes. Your womb shrinks, your brain grows. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould mentions these too. And
But
therefore,
Dr. Isaac, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
okay.
Yes, sir.
Therefore, he said, white women should not go to college because white men will not be able to have children from them because their womb shrinks. Therefore, they will turn to black women and have children who are inferior because they're part black. You see, these kind of philosophies were based in ignorance, short-sightedness, stupidity.
Right.
And
Sure.
there are many, many such researches. I can show you books that are
Right.
written.
But one of the concepts that was written in the Supreme Court something like 25 years ago was Sandra Day O'Connor, a justice of the Supreme Court,
Yes.
who basically said everything you've said, that this was a wrong that needed to be righted. But she went on to say, at some point, we will be done righting the wrong. And she had estimated it would be about 20 some odd years from now that the correction would be sufficient. In other words, the compensatory reaction by saying, let's make sure we consider every African-American candidate equally, that will have been done. And then the universities will now treat everyone the same, regardless of race or gender. And they can stop looking at race and gender at some point. Now, she made a prediction that it was 20 some odd years. It's hard to know when that moment actually is upon us. But the idea being, there would come a time in the future when we would stop evaluating people based on race and gender. And that's what it seems like this time has become, according to the Supreme Court.
Of course, the Supreme Court is a great institution, and it has always had fair, just Supreme Court leaders. You mentioned Sandra O'Connor, and the great one who passed a couple of years ago,
Ginsburg.
And there are still many important people who recognize past mistakes and the need to correct them. For me, affirmative action, whether it is in education or in business too, it doesn't mean, again, somehow or other, lowering the level of intellectual or work capacity. It just means creating equality. In fact, maybe instead of calling affirmative action, maybe we should call it equal admission, equal or blind admission.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Blind admission. If we go along that line, if we don't look at when the students come to be interviewed at Harvard, at Yale, maybe they should wear a mask.
Right. But that's the
which
idea.
Would mean, which would mean no legacy admissions, no, maybe not any sports admissions or anything like that either, where everyone, and then you kind of go into, well, what is qualified for what?
That's a good question. Universities, of course, interestingly, do admit a lot of students, not only on the basis of intellectual or academic ability. They admit a few students on the basis of their special qualifications, like sport or music. But that doesn't only apply to African Americans. I have known at Harvard, I had students. In fact, one of them who graduated and became a Chicago Bear football player. And I have known a white student also who was admitted because of his ability to play football. Yes, there are a few that universities actually admit. Even before that, white and black students, because they need students who are good at music or sport or art. And I would say some of the students who went to Harvard and became great movie actors were not necessarily the most intellectual students. I don't think so. So your question is very good. They're individuals, of course, who even before affirmative action were being admitted to Harvard because they needed football players, they needed basketball players, but they were a minority. And the same happens at Princeton University and at Yale, where they do admit some students on the basis of their special qualifications in art.
Does it surprise you? Mark and I, we are active in the part of business that's often called entrepreneurial capitalism, which is to say smaller businesses. We don't tend to be part of things that are large, Fortune 500, corporate America. We tend to be part of smaller companies. Would it surprise you if we told you that we rarely, almost never, come across discrimination on the basis of race or gender in the hiring of people for these companies, because these companies are so desperate for talented people? You know, they're small companies. They don't have the benefits and the brand names of the large companies. And so if they come into contact with a talented person, they overlook everything because they need the talent. And I don't want to speak for Mark, but that's my experience, is that in the smaller company area, they don't even have the luxury of being discriminatory because they need any talented person who will work with them. Does that surprise you, or is that something you'd surprised to hear?
Well, I congratulate your companies that do that. It doesn't necessarily surprise me. Ironically, although there has always been discrimination in other sectors, like in business, maybe in the world of business, there have been a few, even before affirmative action, like the person who invented the peanut butter, from what I understand, was an African American.
Sure.
And
George Carver, right?
Yes, quite a few African Americans who've contributed and invented some very important merchandise in the American history. So maybe I think the discrimination existed, especially in academia. Maybe it existed in government, but in a lesser degree, and in business, in certain levels levels
Sure.
of business, if not in
Yeah.
every level of business. I am very happy to hear from you what you told me, and that is the way it should be. There ought to be fairness. Right now in this country, as you know, there are some very highly successful business people. I don't want to
Yeah, sure.
start listing their
But
you
even geographically, where I met you at the Chauncey Conference Center in Princeton is equal distance from Princeton University, where you taught, and Rider University, where I teach. And Princeton University, has come a long way in terms of reversing some of the discriminatory practices that you described from a century ago. Rider University, which does not have the same advantages of Princeton, there are not 10 times or 100 times as many students applying for those positions as there are positions. So Rider ends up being very organically diverse because they really want anybody who really wants to be there. It sounds like the real need for affirmative action is in these highest echelons of institutions, academic or business, where they're so hard to get into that getting into them almost promises you a great life, and that there are so many more people who want to get into them than they have spots for. And those are the institutions that 100 years ago practiced discrimination unfairly, totally wrongly, and now 100 years later needed corrective measures. But again, now Harvard knows, without a single requirement, they know that a more diverse student body is actually a better student body. So can they take their foot off the pedal at some point and say, we don't need to worry about this from a policy point of view, because we already know in having a diverse student body is better for everybody?
Well, I hope what you're saying is right. I hope not. I hope not. I hope we are only going forward and not backward. You see, we are actually in an age where some of the science and philosophy of race of the 18th, especially 19th and 18th century, terrible, terrible scientific study. There was something called eugenics, for instance. I don't know if you're familiar with eugenics.
Yes.
And those people who tried to study, and as I said before, categorize the peoples of Europe, Africa, China, American Indian into 4 categories according to intellectual ability. Those days are fortunately over. They're over. Again, I mentioned the work of people like Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, who explained very well. What is really shocking and amazing is we talk about affirmative action. Well, the truth of the matter is, if you look at some of the studies of this 19th century, you think that it's a dream world. They used to take heads of black and white people, measure them, and then say, "Oh, this is intellectually higher. This eugenics studies, and all these unfortunate study trying to distinguish people on the basis of their color." I think, to the credit of Princeton, I think there was one Princeton president who once said, probably the black color is due to sunshine, to sun, but we probably the same. He had slaves at one stage, but he did, however, claim, and there's some truth to that, because we are all children of Adam and Eve. But what happened is, I think, due to slavery, and as one of the Princeton presidents also said, slavery has intellectually and morally corrupted us. Looking at African people, using African people as tools, some of these so-called half-baked scientists start studying the differentiations between people of color, race, white,
Yeah,
black,
of course.
Indian. And then they started relating to that in eugenics, making the white.
No, of course. But I and I don't mean to cut you off, and I also don't mean to be insensitive to the arc of time, which is very important. After all, those who don't understand their history are doomed to repeat it. But a lot of those ideas came from a time that we now almost universally agree was crazy.
Crazy.
Wrong.
Yes.
And
Foolish.
foolish, crazy, wrong, and horrifying.
Yeah, horrifying.
Horrifying. But
ignorant is another word.
And ignorant. And then we come to, there must be a time when, through the good virtues of education, people come to see things differently. They have a new knowledge, a new awareness, and they don't believe those things anymore. And then therefore, the next African-American man or woman who applies to go to Harvard will either be considered on the basis of their race for all the thoughtful things you've said so far, or Harvard will say, we're not paying attention to that anymore. And you think which is how they have to do it now, if you think when that happens, that in the year 2023 is a great injustice to that history?
Injustice to the history of...
In other words, we should never, ever forget that bad things were done for the wrong reasons. But in the year 2023, is there going to come a point where when we say we are no longer contemplating something like race when we make an admissions decision, is that an insult to the history, or is that just a recognition of the modern day we are in?
No, it's my prayer that we can say all this is behind us. Mm-hmm. Behind us. Unfortunately, knowing human nature, there would always be certain individuals who are misguided, who are blind, and who are self-centered, who really think they are better than others, even on individual basis, even between white and white. So while as much of this is behind us, thanks to the Almighty, it's behind us, and I hope it will remain behind us. As you can see, that only last week in the Supreme Court, some of these decisions were made. Why? Were the judges who decided this, are they going back? Are they blind? Or what is it? For me, it's not even a matter of law, but it is a matter of truth, philosophical truth, the truth of creation of the world, that we are all created equal in the eyes of God. Maybe we have different colors because of the effect of sign on our, there's something that causes coloring our body.
Pigmentation.
Pigmentation.
Melanin. Yeah.
But I'm optimistic that we are moving forward. But at the same time, even while I'm optimistic, I know that the uphill fight, to a certain extent, is going to continue because of the fact that there are some individuals, like only this past year on Princeton campus, there was a clash between students who believed in justice and equality and others who were trying to promote white superiority. Just last week, there were not many of them. It was in the newspapers. So, but on a optimistic side, I think the good eventually, and the truth that the world stands on peace, truth, and justice, according to the Hebrew teaching, will win. And therefore, I am very optimistic that we're going to move forward. Even if the Supreme Court reverses affirmative action, I don't think the universities are going to pay too much attention to that. Yeah. I think so.
Mark, what do you think?
It's a great conversation, and I appreciate the historical lens. And I think the difference between business, as Louis, you were alluding to, that in our world, it's really results are kind of the only thing that matters at the end of the day. We serve customers well, we increase our revenues, we grow our businesses, we produce a profit, and results are extraordinarily objective when it comes to business. And so just like in sports, you just take the best player available. You don't care what their background, if they can score points and win you the game, you're on the team. And if I can pay a little more to get a little better player, then I'm going to do it. And it's the same thing for most businesses. I think in academia and government, results are, what are results for a university? What is their purpose? What is their overall objectives? How do I get the best players on the team? Now, if you're a research institute, that might be something where you say, as you said, Lewis, with diversity, to say, well, all creativity comes from all kinds of different ideas colliding. As you started the podcast with the collision at the bar with Dr. Isaac here, all creativity happens that same way. All different subjects, different ideas, all coming together and making a new third thing. It's how we have all the devices we have. They're not from one discipline or another. It's a diverse group of ideas and thoughts coming together. And so maybe those are results for a research institute that would promote diversity in some way or another. But what is the results of government? I don't really even know. I can't even answer that question. Where for us, it's just very objective. We score points and we try to win the game.
So that's the question. So so in with your time at Harvard or Princeton, how do they know if they're doing a good job? And maybe one step back, how do they know if the way they're going about it, their policies, their procedures, their admissions techniques, are doing a good job? What is a good job out of those institutions? What does success look like out of Harvard or Princeton? What are they trying to do?
That's an interesting question.
Grow their endowment, or
well, of course, on a general level, but it's actually, to tell you the truth, it does not depend on the institution as a whole. It depends on individuals. Certain professors who are farsighted, who are really seeking. I mean, I've been reading a lot about even presidents of universities who held slaves, who were also saying we are morally disturbed about this. So I would say at Harvard, there were, I can call a few individual professors, white professors, who fought for justice, who fought for affirmative action, who fought for admitting Black students, who fought for teaching Black studies. So what I'm trying to say is that institutions, of course, are important, but we need those individuals who have the courage to stand for truth, for justice, and it is those individuals who eventually can have influence on the institutions, whether it be in the business world or academic world or medical world. And may God keep giving us those good individuals. I think the two of you are good individuals. I listen to you and I see through your words, your hearts. And so even at Harvard, when I remember in the 60s, if a few students didn't rise up, if people like Martin Luther King didn't come up, if some professors like a couple of my own professors, I remember George Williams, I can mention him. He was a descendant of Roger Williams, very distinguished professor of church history. I never forget that when I was seeking courses on Ethiopian history, Ethiopian religion, Ethiopian history, he was one who went and complained to the university. Why are we not teaching these courses? Why are we not teaching the Ethiopian classical Ethiopian language? And George Williams was originally a minister. He became the dean of the Divinity School. And I always think of individuals like that.
Yeah, it is about individuals. It is about individuals
who play a very key role in leading us to the way of truth, to the way of justice. And God bring more such individuals. I can mention a few Harvard professors who I would consider were just and who were fighting for truth. And then there were a few others, however, who were on the opposite side. So luckily, truth ultimately wins.
Thank you, Dr. Isaac. Thank you for spending a few minutes with us today. Your lifetime of experience is incredible. And I'm super honored that we got to meet just a couple of months ago, and we've been talking quite a bit ever since. You are a light in my life. Thank you so much, Dr.
Well, I thank you so very much. I think like a circle of individuals who are good, and I'm meeting you. I mean, I'm going to put you in the list of the good people I have met in my life. And the truth of the matter is, I know from my personal experience what it means to struggle for equal rights in education. And I know what it means to struggle for equal rights in government and business from some of my own students. But personally, I know in academia, I am glad to say in the 60s, I was, many of my students would witness, I was at the forefront of the fight for equal admission, for equal education, the equal teaching of the history, the culture, and the language of African people. I played a role in that. I'm most grateful to the Almighty for having put me there at Harvard, and many of my students are still in touch with me, and remind me the little humble role I played to to uh, to do this work. And for me, it's not just because of the law of affirmative action. It's because
Right.
of the law of the Almighty God, who created us equal, black, white, yellow, as the prophet said. So that is, I am very sorry. I didn't say much more, but I can speak a lot because it was in front of me that the affirmative action was created in
Right.
1965.
You're why affirmative action was created. You are the reason why.
Well,
Yeah.
I was there, and I remember 4 graduate students when I came to Harvard, and about 16 black students. When I left, there were 200, 300, just because there were a few just people, Martin Luther King's, the farmers, the James Farmers, I remember, the
Yeah.
fighters for equal justice, and then some of the students on campus, like some of my own students. I remember Skip Griffin. I remember Wesley Prophet. I can mention some of them.
I know,
can
I'm sure.
Tony Hilliard, Stephen
Yeah.
Hill, who were
Well,
the
no,
blacks.
these are great. We can't. The names are too much for us. We can't handle it. It's too much information.
They were
But
at the forefront. So now we move forward with affirmative action. We're not going to move backward. Whatever the Supreme Court is above and below, above and above the Supreme Court is the Almighty God, who is the ultimate Supreme Court.
There you go.
Yeah, and he knows
thank you, Dr. Isaac.
he created us equal, and he wants us to live in peace together equally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time today. Thank you very much. Wonderful. So that's, a great teacher, you just want to shut up and listen.
Pretty much. I mean, I learned a bunch of history there, and what was coming to me as he was talking was, and I do know a little bit about history and the formation of the country and the debate that even existed in the formation of the United States, with thinking about the South, big, huge farms, who's going to work these things, and then Thomas Jefferson and bringing thought leaders in to basically create a world in which Black people were thought of as inferior, for really the sole purposes of saving their land and not having to work it themselves. In the North, it didn't exist because the farms were smaller. The distance between the Appalachian Mountains and the coast were much tighter. So there was no need for that type of labor, where in the South it was different. So it's very interesting how people acting out of scarcity and power, scarcity and fear, really has shaped a lot of the way people act versus abundance and love. The idea that there's more than enough to go around, and which we've talked about before. So I found like the history lesson really interesting, and I'm sure that could go for days, if not weeks.
Yeah, no, he's fun to talk with and listen to. Yep. I like that a lot. All right, Mark. Well, we have much to process now, much to think, as we've got a history lesson from somebody who was there at the beginning, truly there at the beginning, at the epicenter of this. As you know, the Supreme Court case was actually with Harvard. So this is the guy who started there, and now here it is 50 some odd years later, and it's at this moment over. What he started or what they started is now over. Yeah.
Indeed. And before we go, the reason I brought this topic to talk about is that it's pretty obvious that it starts in academia in terms of affirmative action ending, and it will come to business, and where hiring decisions won't be able to be made on race. And I would say that from my perspective, they never should have been in the first place. And it should be from a perspective of abundance and love and creating the results that you want. And I love what he said about being the individual, because if we can help one of our employees, one of our customers live the life that they want, all these topics sort of don't matter anymore, right? You can just kind of serve the one and it all works out.
Yeah. I mean, I've always felt like I have almost an easy out because, as I said during our conversation, we dwell in the world of entrepreneurial capitalism, which is a very egalitarian place because it's a hard place. But I suppose if you're at the top of a really big, dare I call it fat company, where to get a high-level VP job at that is sort of like getting into Harvard. It's like all this good stuff comes your way after that. I get why there's why some people who get those jobs get them for the wrong reasons. But in our neck of the woods, I just feel like if you can do your job well, they just don't care anything about where you come from. And it's interesting that even in business, as you said, this is going to find its way to business. Even within business, I think there's sort of like that level of business, which is like the Harvard of business, and then us scrapping away at the Rider University and the level of business,
which represents like 92% of the global economy. So we're definitely fighting on the edges here.
All right, Mark. Thank you for joining me in this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for recommending it, suggesting it.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Thanks for listening to another episode of What I See, where we explore the stories of the visionaries shaping our world. We hope you found insights and inspiration from our guests. Don't forget to subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode, and continue to be a part of the conversation. See you next time on What I See.